Montana Territory, November 1883. Snow already covered the ground when Thomas Brennan was still digging, 30 feet of tunnels beneath his homestead, while neighbors rushed to split enough firewood for winter. They called it wasteful labor, called him obsessed. Every other settler built their fireplace inside their cabin, burned wood all day, and chopped more when it ran out. Brennan dug channels 3 feet underground, connecting his main fire pit to stone chambers beneath each building on his property. He lined everything with field stone and clay, creating an underground network that took him 4 months to complete. Then December hit. Temperatures dropped to 40 below. Wind cut across the prairie for 6 straight weeks. Standard heating methods failed. Families burned through entire wood piles by January, rationing warmth to survive. But Brennan's system heated his cabin, barn, workshop, and root cellar using 60% less wood than a single fireplace. What did he understand about heat distribution and thermal mass that made his neighbors' methods look primitive by spring? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The morning of January 12th, 1888, dawned deceptively warm across Yellow Medicine County, Minnesota. Thomas Brennan stepped outside his 12 by 16-foot cabin into air that felt almost spring-like, 40 degrees and still, with that peculiar hush that old-timers recognized as dangerous. Inside his squat prairie dwelling, 2 mercury thermometers hung on bent nails at shoulder height, positioned 5 feet off the rough-hewn floor. One measured the air near his iron stove. The other, mounted on the far wall, tracked the temperature where his family slept. Most homesteaders in 48 Township had built their chimneys the accepted way. Black iron stovepipe rose straight up from the firebox, made a quick elbow through the wall or roof, and escaped into the wind as fast as physics allowed. The reasoning was sound enough. Get the smoke out before it could back up into your living space, maintain strong draft, avoid the creosote buildup that came with long, cooling runs of pipe. The local tin shop man, Henrik Olsen, preached this gospel to anyone who would listen. Short and straight meant safe and reliable. Every extra foot of horizontal pipe was another place for joints to leak, another surface for soot to collect, another opportunity for disaster. Brennan had listened to Olsen's advice, nodded politely, then built something entirely different. His stovepipe rose the standard 18 inches from his cast iron heating stove, enough to establish draft before making a 90-degree turn toward the east wall. From there, 6-inch black pipe ran nearly the entire length of his cabin ceiling, 14 feet of iron suspended from the rafters with twisted wire hangers spaced every 3 feet. Only at the far end did the pipe turn upward again, passing through a proper wall thimble into the external chimney stack he had built from fieldstone and clay. The neighbors had called it wasteful when they watched him crimp those pipe sections together, sealing each joint so condensation and soot would not drip into his living space. They called it backwards when they saw him threading support wires through the log rafters, calculating load and sag like a man building a bridge instead of a chimney. Old Henrik Olsen had shaken his head and predicted smoke back, poor draft, and a cabin that would drive the family outside choking and gasping. The consensus was clear. Thomas Brennan was overthinking a simple problem and would pay for his stubbornness with a winter of misery. But as the deceptively mild morning gave way to afternoon, something extraordinary became apparent. The long run of pipe across Brennan's ceiling was not just functional, it was performing like a radiator. Every foot of that black iron surface was transferring heat from the smoke inside to the air in his cabin, while his neighbors' stoves threw heat from their fireboxes and immediately sent their hottest exhaust gases up and out. Brennan was capturing that escaping energy and putting it to work. The physics were straightforward enough for any man who had worked iron. Smoke leaving a stove was still carrying the majority of the fire's energy. In a standard installation, that heat disappeared up the chimney and into the sky. But Brennan's horizontal run created 25 square feet of hot metal surface inside his living space. The pipe acted as one continuous radiator fin, warming the cabin air through simple conduction and convection. More importantly, the extended path allowed the exhaust gases to give up their heat gradually while maintaining just enough velocity to preserve draft. By noon, with outside temperatures climbing toward 50 degrees in the false spring warmth, Both thermometers in Brennan's cabin read a steady 68 degrees. His neighbors, burning the same oak and ash cordwood in similar stoves, were seeing internal temperatures in the low 50s. The difference was not dramatic yet, but it was consistent and measurable. More telling was the distribution of warmth. In cabins with short chimneys, heat radiated outward from the stove in a tight circle, leaving the sleeping areas perpetually cold. Brennan's ceiling pipe warmed his entire space evenly, creating comfortable conditions from wall to wall. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the barometric pressure began dropping with alarming speed. Old-timers recognized the signs, the stillness, the false warmth, the peculiar color of the western sky. Weather was building somewhere beyond the horizon, and when it arrived, it would test every piece of equipment and every decision made during the easier months. Thomas Brennan checked his thermometers one final time before the storm hit. The near thermometer, positioned close to his stove, read 72 degrees. The far thermometer, mounted on the wall where his children would sleep, showed 68 degrees. A 4-degree difference across 14 feet, remarkable uniformity for a frontier cabin heated by a single iron stove. Down the section line in cabins built according to conventional wisdom, the temperature differences were far more dramatic. Near the stove, 70 degrees. At the sleeping wall, 55 degrees. The variance spoke to a fundamental truth about heat distribution that most homesteaders had never considered. Hot air rises, but it also moves horizontally when pushed by convection currents. The long run of pipe across Brennan's ceiling was creating a thermal highway, carrying warmth from the stove end of the cabin to the sleeping end through the simple mechanism of heated iron transferring energy to moving air. What Thomas Brennan understood, and what his neighbors were about to learn, was that a chimney did not have to be merely an escape route for smoke. It could be a heat recovery system, a way of capturing energy that would otherwise disappear into the prairie sky. The principle was not revolutionary. European heating systems had used long flue runs for centuries, and American inventors were already patenting stovepipe radiators based on the same concept. But on the northern plains, where fuel was precious and winters could kill, the difference between capturing heat and wasting it was sometimes the difference between survival and tragedy. As darkness fell on January 12, 1888, the western sky began showing the first signs of what weather historians would later call the children's blizzard. The temperature differential between Thomas Brennan's thermometers and those in conventional cabins was about to become far more than an academic curiosity. The construction of what neighbors mockingly called Brennan's horizontal chimney had begun in late October, when most sensible homesteaders were finishing their winter preparations, not tearing apart perfectly functional stove installations. Thomas Brennan had spent his first brutal Dakota winter in a cabin heated by conventional methods, stovepipe rising 18 inches from his cast iron heating stove, before turning 90 degrees and exiting straight through the wall. He had burned nearly 6 cords of oak that winter and still woke to ice formations on the interior walls. The experience taught him that heat was too precious to waste, and smoke leaving a stove was still carrying most of the fire's energy straight out into the prairie wind. The rebuild started with the basic components any homesteader could acquire: 6-inch black iron stovepipe, available by the section at Henrik Olsen's tin shop for 75 cents per 32-inch length. Brennan calculated he would need 6 sections for his 14-foot horizontal run, plus 2 90-degree elbows and the standard wall thimble for the final exit. The total cost ran just under $5, expensive for a homesteader, but cheaper than burning an extra 2 cords of wood every winter. The critical first step was establishing proper draft. Brennan began with a vertical rise of 24 inches from his stove, using a single section of pipe to get the hot gases moving upward with sufficient velocity. This initial climb was essential. Without it, the horizontal run would create too much resistance, and the smoke would back up into the cabin. The vertical section also served as a heat chimney, creating the convection current that would pull exhaust gases through the longer, cooler horizontal path ahead. At the 24-inch mark, Brennan installed his first 90-degree elbow, purchased from Olsen with the grudging warning that every turn in a stovepipe system reduced draft efficiency. The elbow redirected the flow eastward, beginning the long horizontal journey across the cabin ceiling. Here, precision became crucial. Each subsequent section of pipe had to be fitted with its crimped end inserted into the expanded end of the previous section, creating a male-female connection that would not leak smoke or condensate into the living space. Brennan sealed each joint with a thin layer of stove cement, working methodically to ensure that every cubic inch of smoke would travel the intended path. Supporting the horizontal run required engineering that most homesteaders never considered. 14 feet of 6-inch iron pipe, even empty, weighed over 60 pounds. Filled with hot gases and accumulating soot, the total load would exceed 80 pounds. Standard practice might have been to nail a few iron straps to the wall and hope for the best, but sagging pipe meant open joints, and open joints meant smoke in the cabin. Brennan cut 12-gauge wire into 4-foot lengths and threaded them through holes he bored in the log rafters, creating suspension points every 3 feet along the horizontal run. Each section of pipe rested in a wire cradle that distributed the weight evenly while allowing for thermal expansion. The physics of heat transfer were working in Brennan's favor from the moment the first fire was lit. Black iron pipe has excellent thermal conductivity, meaning heat moves readily from the hot gases inside to the metal surface, then from the metal surface to the surrounding air. A standard vertical installation might expose 8 square feet of pipe surface to the cabin interior. Brennan's horizontal run exposed 28 square feet, more than 3 times the radiating surface area. The extended path also increased what engineers call dwell time, allowing the exhaust gases to transfer more of their thermal energy before exiting the building. Temperature management became the key to making the system work reliably. Smoke entering the horizontal section at 400 degrees would cool as it traveled, but cooling too rapidly would reduce draft and potentially cause backdraft problems. Brennan solved this by installing a damper in the vertical section, a simple iron disc that could be rotated to partially restrict flow. When starting a cold stove, he opened the damper fully to establish strong draft. Once the fire was burning hot and steady, he could close the damper partially, slowing the exhaust flow just enough to extract maximum heat without killing the draw. The cleaning regimen was more demanding than anything required by a straight pipe system. Soot and creosote accumulated more rapidly in the horizontal sections because the slower-moving, cooler gases had more time to deposit particulates on the pipe walls. Every 7 to 10 days during peak heating season, Brennan disconnected the pipe sections and scraped them clean with a wire brush, removing the black residue that would otherwise restrict airflow and reduce heat transfer efficiency. The maintenance was tedious but essential. A clogged horizontal run would create dangerous backdraft conditions that could fill the cabin with deadly carbon monoxide. What made Brennan's system revolutionary was not any single component, but the integration of well-understood principles into a frontier practical package. European heating systems had used long flue runs for centuries, capturing waste heat through thermal mass and extended surface area. American inventors like Chester Adams in Toledo, Ohio, were already patenting commercial stovepipe radiators based on the same concept of intercepting hot exhaust gases and extracting their energy before allowing them to escape. But most of these systems required expensive manufactured components and professional installation. Brennan had achieved the same results using standard materials and hand tools. The performance difference was immediately measurable, where a conventional installation might transfer 60% of the fuel's energy into the cabin. Brennan's horizontal system captured closer to 85%. The additional 25% came directly from heat that would otherwise have disappeared up the chimney. On a practical level, this meant burning roughly 1 cord less wood per winter, a savings of $15 to $20 in labor and materials, enough to pay for the entire pipe installation in a single heating season. By mid-December, word of the horizontal chimney had spread throughout 48 Township, carried by neighbors who visited Brennan's cabin and felt the remarkable uniformity of temperature from wall to wall. The skepticism remained strong. Henrik Olsen continued to predict disaster, but the measurable results were becoming difficult to ignore. Thomas Brennan had turned his chimney into a heat recovery system, and as the winter of 1888 deepened toward its historic climax, that recovered heat was about to mean the difference between comfort and catastrophe. The barometric pressure had been falling all morning on January 12th, but most settlers in 48 Township were too busy. with daily survival to notice the subtle signs building on the western horizon. Mary O'Sullivan, the schoolteacher at District 43, had dismissed her students early when she noticed the peculiar stillness in the air and the way her weather glass was dropping faster than she had ever seen. Children who had walked to school in shirt sleeves that morning were sent home bundled in whatever extra clothing could be found, with strict instructions to stay close to their houses and not venture out for evening chores. By noon, the fall spring warmth had peaked at 52 degrees, remarkable for mid-January in southern Minnesota. Thomas Brennan checked his thermometers and noted that both registered a comfortable 68 degrees inside his cabin, with his horizontal pipe system maintaining its steady, even heat distribution. Down the section line, his nearest neighbor, Jakob Lindstrom, was experiencing the typical hot and cold zones of conventional heating, 75 degrees near his stove, but only 58 degrees where his children slept. Neither man understood yet that they were living through the calm before one of the most lethal weather events in Great Plains history. The first sign of trouble came at 1:30 in the afternoon when a wall of blue-black clouds appeared on the northwestern horizon, advancing with unnatural speed across the prairie. Within minutes, the temperature began dropping at a rate that defied belief, 5 degrees in 10 minutes, then 10 degrees in the next 10 minutes. The wind arrived like a freight train, building from a whisper to a sustained roar of 60 miles per hour in less than 20 minutes. What had been a pleasant January afternoon became a white hell that would trap families in their homes for the next 14 hours. The blizzard that meteorologists would later name the children's blizzard struck with the violence of a natural disaster compressed into fast motion. Snow fell at rates exceeding 2 inches per hour, driven horizontally by winds that made visibility drop to less than 10 feet. Drifts began forming immediately, piling against buildings and fence lines with the efficiency of a construction crew working at supernatural speed. Within 3 hours, some drifts reached 12 to 15 feet in height, burying entire cabins to their roof lines and trapping families inside structures that had become snow caves. Temperature readings taken at official weather stations across the region documented the severity of the event. In Minneapolis, the mercury fell from 37 degrees at noon to 14 below zero by midnight. In towns closer to 48 Township, the drop was even more dramatic. New Ulm recorded a 48-degree temperature fall in less than 6 hours. But official weather stations told only part of the story. In isolated homestead cabins where survival depended entirely on personal heating systems and fuel supplies, the crisis was measured not in degrees below freezing, but in degrees above death. The wind chill created conditions that could kill exposed skin in minutes. More dangerous for homesteading families was the way the storm transformed heating from a comfort issue into a life or death calculation. Every British thermal unit wasted was fuel that would not be available during the long night ahead. Cabins with inefficient heating systems faced a brutal choice: burn through their entire winter wood supply in a single storm, or ration fuel and risk freezing to death before dawn. Jakob Lindstrom found himself making exactly that calculation as darkness fell on January 12th. His conventional stove installation was consuming split oak at an alarming rate, demanding a fresh log every 20 minutes to maintain barely tolerable temperatures. Even with constant feeding, the areas of his cabin away from the immediate stove vicinity were dropping below 40 degrees. His wife wrapped the children in every blanket and quilt they owned, but with outdoor temperatures plunging toward 20 below zero and wind driving through every crack in the log chinking, the cabin was losing heat faster than his standard chimney system could replace it. Thomas Brennan faced the same storm with entirely different resources. His horizontal pipe system was extracting heat from exhaust gases that would have been wasted in a conventional installation, effectively giving him 30% more thermal energy from each piece of firewood. More critically, his ceiling-mounted radiator was distributing that captured heat evenly throughout the cabin space. While neighbors struggled with 20-degree temperature differences between their stove areas and sleeping areas, Brennan maintained a consistent 62 degrees from wall to wall. The performance difference became measurable in fuel consumption. Where conventional installations were burning a log every 15 to 20 minutes to maintain minimal comfort, Brennan's system required fresh fuel only every 30 to 35 minutes. Over the course of a 14-hour blizzard night, That efficiency translated to burning roughly half the cordwood required by standard heating methods. For families with limited fuel supplies, the difference could determine whether they would see sunrise with all fingers and toes intact. By 10 o'clock that evening, with the storm reaching peak intensity and outdoor temperatures hovering near 25 below zero, the contrast between heating systems had become a matter of neighborhood survival. Mary O'Sullivan, the schoolteacher, had taken refuge in Brennan's cabin along with the Lindstrom family, whose own dwelling had become uninhabitable despite constant fire feeding. 8 people crowded into Brennan's 12 by 16-foot space, yet the temperature remained steady at 61 degrees, warm enough for children to sleep comfortably and adults to function without the constant shivering that marked the early stages of hypothermia. The storm continued through the night with unrelenting fury, killing an estimated 235 people across Nebraska, South Dakota, and Minnesota. Most victims were caught away from shelter, but others died in their own homes when heating systems failed or fuel supplies ran out during the crucial hours before dawn. The children's blizzard became a benchmark for measuring not just weather severity, but the life or death importance of efficient heat conservation on the northern plains. For Thomas Brennan and his neighbors crowded around his horizontal chimney system, the storm was proving that captured heat was the difference between survival and tragedy. The true test of Thomas Brennan's horizontal chimney came not in the first hours of the blizzard, but in the deadly period between midnight and dawn on January 13th, when outdoor temperatures reached their lowest point and fuel reserves across 48 Township began running critically short. By 2 in the morning, with 8 people crowded into his 12 by 16-foot cabin, Brennan had burned through only half the cordwood that conventional heating would have required. His 2 mercury thermometers continued their steady readings, 62 degrees near the stove, 60 degrees at the far wall. The difference of 2 degrees across 14 feet represented a level of heat distribution that neighbors had never experienced in their own cabins. Jakob Lindstrom's conventional installation told a different story entirely. Before abandoning his cabin for Brennan's refuge, he had recorded temperatures that illustrated the fundamental problem with straight pipe heating systems. Near his cast iron stove, where he fed split oak every 15 minutes, the air temperature reached 78 degrees. But at his children's sleeping area, barely 12 feet away, his thermometer showed 39 degrees, a 39-degree difference that made half his living space uninhabitable. The problem was not insufficient heat production, but catastrophic heat waste. Hot exhaust gases were escaping up his chimney at temperatures exceeding 400 degrees, carrying away the majority of each log's thermal energy. The physics of heat transfer explained why Brennan's system performed so dramatically better under extreme conditions. Every British thermal unit contains a specific amount of energy, released when wood burns and available for space heating until it disappears up the chimney. In Lindstrom's straight pipe system, exhaust gases traveled less than 4 feet through interior space before exiting the building. Brennan's horizontal run exposed the same hot gases to 16 feet of interior travel, providing 28 square feet of radiating surface compared to 8 square feet in conventional installations. The additional surface area and extended dwell time allowed his system to capture roughly 30% more heat from identical fuel inputs. The mathematical advantage translated into measurable survival benefits during the storm's worst hours. While conventional cabins required fresh cordwood every 18 to 20 minutes to maintain minimal habitability, Brennan's system maintained superior comfort levels with fuel additions every 32 to 35 minutes. Over a 14-hour crisis period, this efficiency meant burning approximately 4 cords of wood instead of 6 cords, a difference that could determine whether a family had enough fuel to survive until rescue or spring thaw. Mary O'Sullivan, the schoolteacher who had taken shelter in Brennan's cabin, documented the performance contrast in her journal entry written 3 days after the storm. Her professional training had taught her to observe and record details that others might miss, and her survival had depended on accurate assessment of heating system reliability. She noted that children sleeping on the floor near Brennan's far wall remained comfortable throughout the night without additional blankets, while similar positions in conventional cabins would have required multiple layers of bedding to prevent hypothermia. The even heat distribution eliminated the dangerous hot and cold zones that characterized most frontier heating systems. The maintenance demands of Brennan's horizontal system proved manageable even during emergency conditions. At 4 in the morning, while the storm continued at full intensity, he disconnected 2 sections of his ceiling pipe and scraped away the soot accumulation that would have restricted airflow in a less maintained system. The cleaning process took 11 minutes and improved draft efficiency enough to extend his fuel intervals by an additional 3 minutes per log. In conventional installations, such maintenance was either impossible during operation or unnecessary because the short pipe runs did not accumulate problematic soot levels. Henrik Olsen, the tin shop man who had predicted disaster for Brennan's unconventional design, arrived at the cabin near dawn with his own family in tow. His house, heated by a stove system he had installed according to his own professional standards, had become uninhabitable when his fuel supply ran low and temperatures dropped below tolerable levels. The irony was not lost on the assembled survivors. The man who had sold pipe and elbows to half the township while preaching short and straight installation methods was now depending on the horizontal system he had publicly ridiculed. Olsen's arrival provided an opportunity for direct comparison that would influence heating system design throughout the region. His cabin, located only 300 yards from Brennan's, was nearly identical in construction, 12 by 18 feet, 7-foot ceiling, single-room layout with similar chinking and insulation. Both buildings used the same model of cast iron heating stove, and both families burned split oak from the same woodlot. The only significant difference was chimney design, making the temperature differential a controlled experiment in heat recovery efficiency. The results were documented by multiple witnesses and became the foundation for rapid adoption of horizontal pipe systems throughout Yellow Medicine County. Olsen's cabin, despite constant fire tending, had reached a maximum internal temperature of 41 degrees during the storm's worst hours. Brennan's cabin, with 8 occupants generating additional body heat, maintained 62 degrees with significantly less fuel consumption. The 21-degree advantage represented the difference between survival and potential death during extended cold exposure. By sunrise on January 13th, as the wind finally began to subside and the temperature started its slow climb back toward survivable levels, the practical superiority of captured heat over wasted heat had been proven under the most extreme conditions the northern plains could deliver. Thomas Brennan had burned 3 1/2 cords of oak during the 14-hour crisis. Similar cabins with conventional heating had exhausted 5 to 6 cords while providing inferior comfort and safety. The horizontal chimney had transformed a potentially fatal night into a manageable inconvenience, demonstrating that heat recovery was not a luxury improvement but an essential survival technology. The storm had killed hundreds of people across the Great Plains, but every person who had taken shelter in Brennan's cabin survived with no symptoms of frostbite or hypothermia. The horizontal pipe system had captured enough waste heat to make the difference between tragedy and safety, proving that on the frontier, engineering efficiency was often the thin line between living and dying. The transformation of heating practices across Fortier Township began within days of the children's blizzard's end. Henrik Olsen, whose professional reputation had been built on advocating short, straight chimney installations, found himself inundated with requests for horizontal pipe systems identical to Thomas Brennan's design. The tin shop man who had spent months warning neighbors about the dangers of extended pipe runs was now measuring cabin ceilings and calculating support requirements for systems he had once dismissed as foolhardy. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all Olsen himself, who had spent the storm's worst hours warming his hands around Brennan's ceiling-mounted radiator. The economic mathematics of heat recovery made conversion inevitable for most homesteaders. Brennan's fuel savings during the blizzard, burning 3 1/2 cords instead of 6, represented a difference of $12 to $15 in wood costs for a single storm. Over an entire heating season, the horizontal system promised to reduce fuel consumption by 25 to 30%, a savings that would pay for the pipe installation within one winter. More compelling was the safety factor. Families who had nearly frozen in their own homes, despite constant fire tending, understood that efficient heat distribution could mean the difference between survival and tragedy during the next extreme weather event. By March of 1888, 7 cabins in the immediate district had been retrofitted with horizontal pipe systems based on Brennan's design. The installations followed a standardized pattern that had evolved through trial and error: 18 to 24 inches of vertical rise from the stove to establish draft, followed by the longest possible horizontal run the cabin dimensions would allow, supported every 3 feet with wire hangers strong enough to bear the pipe's weight, plus accumulated soot. The final vertical section to the exterior chimney was positioned to minimize heat loss, while maintaining adequate draw for reliable operation. The blacksmith Lars Johansson emerged as the district's leading expert in fabricating the specialized hardware required for horizontal installations. His workshop produced the iron brackets, wire hangers, and adjustable dampers that made the systems practical for homesteaders who lacked advanced metalworking skills. Johansson's innovations included a spring-loaded support system that accommodated thermal expansion without loosening joints, and a hinged cleaning access that allowed pipe sections to be disconnected for maintenance without disrupting the entire installation. His modifications transformed Brennan's original concept into a reproducible technology that could be installed by any homesteader with basic carpentry skills. The adoption pattern followed the social networks that connected frontier communities. Families who had witnessed the performance difference during the blizzard became advocates, sharing technical details and installation tips with relatives and neighbors throughout Yellow Medicine County. Mary O'Sullivan, the schoolteacher whose survival had depended on Brennan's heating system, documented the spread of horizontal chimneys in her correspondence with the county superintendent of schools. By her count, more than 40 cabins had been modified by the end of the 1888 heating season, with new construction increasingly incorporating horizontal runs as standard features rather than experimental additions. The formal recognition of heat recovery principles came through the patent system that was rapidly documenting and commercializing American heating innovations. Chester F. Adams of Toledo, Ohio, had filed his stovepipe radiator patent in 1880, describing a system that diverted hot exhaust gases through extended metal surfaces to utilize the heat more completely before allowing it to escape the building. Adams's design used manufactured components and professional installation, but the underlying principle was identical to what Brennan had achieved using standard materials and frontier improvisation. The patent documentation provided technical validation for what prairie families had, learned through necessity. Chimneys could be heat recovery systems rather than mere smoke disposal methods. Commercial manufacturers began offering purpose-built components that formalized the horizontal chimney concept for customers who preferred factory-made solutions over hand-fabricated installations. The Riverside Stove Company introduced a line of stovepipe drums designed to intercept waste heat and radiate it into living spaces before gases reached the chimney. The National Radiator Works marketed an integrated system that combined extended pipe runs with thermal mass elements, promising to capture up to 40% more heat from standard fuel inputs. These manufactured systems validated the engineering principles that frontier innovators had discovered through experimentation and survival necessity. The cleaning and maintenance protocols that had been essential to Brennan's success became standardized practice across all horizontal installations. Homesteaders learned to disconnect pipe sections every 7 to 10 days during peak burning season, scraping away soot accumulation with wire brushes and checking joints for leaks that could compromise both safety and efficiency. The maintenance rhythm became part of the winter routine, like splitting cordwood or banking fires, a small investment of time that yielded significant returns in fuel savings and heating performance. Safety considerations evolved as the technology spread, and installers gained experience with potential failure modes. Proper clearance from combustible surfaces became a critical specification, with experienced installers recommending 6-inch minimum distances and heat shields where closer proximity was unavoidable. Draft control through damper adjustment required operator skill. Too much restriction could cause dangerous backdraft, while insufficient control wasted the heat recovery benefits that made the systems worthwhile. The learning curve was steep but manageable, and families who mastered the operational requirements found themselves enjoying heating performance that exceeded anything available through conventional methods. The legacy of the children's blizzard extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of lives lost and families displaced. The storm had created laboratory conditions that tested heating system efficiency under extreme stress, revealing the life or death importance of heat recovery in frontier survival. Thomas Brennan's horizontal chimney became the template for a heating revolution that would spread across the northern plains, carried by homesteaders who understood that on the prairie you do not let heat leave until it has done its work. The principle was simple enough for any farmer to understand and implement, yet sophisticated enough to save lives during the harsh winters that defined existence on the American frontier. Within 5 years, horizontal pipe systems had become standard practice in new cabin construction throughout the region, their adoption driven not by fashion or convenience, but by the hard-earned knowledge that efficient heat distribution was essential survival technology in a climate that offered no mercy to the unprepared.